welcome to this part 2 of the circle theory as the foundation for anatomy and physiology in classical East Asian medicine with me, Sharon Weisenbaum. In this part 2, we will be continuing on into the number 3 and the number 4. And you know from part 1 that we were really looking at yin-yang, which is related to the number 2. So in this part, we will actually spend quite a bit of time on the number 3, and hopefully you'll see how important looking at the body and the body's relationship with the cosmos and looking at yin-yang, how important the number 3 becomes and how it morphs into the number 4. So we already looked at the Neijing and circles, and we'll be continuing with this because as we go up in the numbers through to the number 6, which will be the 6 confirmations, we keep going back to the classical texts, especially the Hongdi Neijing. And last time we looked at the yin-yang theory and circles, and we will be going on to discussing the wuxing, and which is the number 5, and the shanghanmun, which is the 3 yin and 3 yang, which make the 6 confirmations or the 6 great sweeping motions. So to get to the wuxing and the 6 confirmations, which will be in our next presentation, we have to go through the number 3 and the number 4. So I hope you find this interesting and, more importantly, useful. So we start just with the question of what is life, what's an organism, how do organisms form and stay alive? And that's really what we're talking about. And that really is what physiology is. And I'm going to go back to this quote from Suen chapter 67 as a sort of foundation for where we're going in this course. Heaven hangs the images. We thought we looked at that. Heaven hanging the images, yang coming down from heaven, and earth completes the form. The 7 heavenly bodies move back and forth through the emptiness like the shuttle of a loom, and the 5 move beautifully over the earth. The earth supports birth and maturation of all types of forms. The emptiness aligns and resonates with the essence chi of heaven. The stirring form essence is just like the roots giving rise to branches and leaves. Looking up, one observes the images. Although far away, they can be known. And last time, just to review, we looked at the question of how circles form and why there is circular movement. Why the Neijing is constantly referring to this circular movement of the celestial bodies around the earth and the circular movements within our bodies. Sort of why is that so important, but also why in nature must it be in the forms of circles, and how when there is a polarity between hot and cold or yang and yin, that there is a natural, through the laws of thermodynamics, a natural force to resolve that polarity, and that organized structures in the form of spinning are created in order to resolve that polarity, and that in an open system, that this movement towards resolution is constant. It never stops because it's an open system. So yang is constantly trying to resolve with yin, and it will never be completely resolved. So just to review, when gradients become large enough and sufficient free energy becomes available, a cycling structure will spontaneously emerge to enable that gradient to dissipate more effectively. Because the universe wants to produce entropy at the fastest possible rate, it will actually create organized systems that help it achieve its thermodynamic goal more efficiently. And so what we're saying is that we are, and the myriad beings are, this organized cycling structure that is created between heaven and earth to promote this resolution. Nature as an open system must resolve gradients and will organize around the most efficient way to do this, which is to cycle. Nature creates organized structures through which to resolve, such as living organisms infused with cycling processes. So now let's go to the number 3. And so the first thing we have with that is this cycling structure that gets created between heaven and earth, between the sun and the earth. And we are one of those cycling structures. And in that way, we have the idea that heaven and earth interact, and therefore there is the person. So this is where we get to the number 3. And we'll see that whenever there's the number 3, it's not like an apple, an orange, and a pear, like there are 3 things. It is always that 2 things interact in order to create the third thing. So we'll see this over and over, that this third thing is in the middle between the 2 things. And the other part, besides the 2 things interacting to create the third thing then becomes the connector between the 2 things. So this interaction to become the person. Then that interaction is continuously going on within us. So before we start, we're clearly going through anatomy and physiology through the lens of numerology. So just a word about odd and even. First of all, even numbers are yin, and we know this because the split line of the I Ching is 2. There are 2 lines, and that is the yin line. It has an opening between the 2 lines, and it is the number 2. So even numbers generally are considered yin relative to odd numbers, which are considered more yang. And also even numbers create a polarity, as we see with yang and yin, that wants to resolve. And so far we've seen yin yang resolve into the person. So even numbers always want to resolve the tension. The even numbers will create polarization. And odd numbers have the organized structure cycling organism at the center. So if the human being is the cycling organism at the center, then that's the number 3 between the 2. And this is true of all odd numbers in classical East Asian medicine. So whenever an even number increases into an odd number, this is going to be adding a center to something, like a person or a myriad being. So number 2 is heaven and earth, and number 3 adds a person that's in the center of that. So that's just a general rule about the odd and even. And we also see in the Hutu or Losher diagrams that, you know, the odd numbers are yang organs, the even numbers are yin organs. So this is just a general rule throughout East Asian medicine. So heaven and earth interact, and therefore there is the person. Anyone who does Qigong it really knows this through experience, where in the Qigong exercises, we are always trying to bring heaven into us and root that with earth in the center of our body, so that yang is in right relationship underneath yin. You know, that all the movements are in one way or another trying to facilitate this movement of the pre-heaven into post-heaven, yin-yang in right relationship. So what we'll be looking at in this discussion on number 3 is several ways that above and below interact to create a middle, and the middle being the joining of the above and below. So we just looked at above heaven, below earth, creating the person. We'll look at the upper jiao, lower jiao, with the middle jiao between them. We'll see this in the pulse, that there's the Tsun and the Chur and the Guan in the middle. And also with the pulse, we'll look at the superficial and the deep with the middle of the pulse in the middle. We'll also look at the Shen and the Jing interacting to create the Qi. In other words, we'll be looking at the 3 treasures. And we'll also look at fluid and ministerial fire interacting to create blood. And we'll briefly look at the future and the past with the present moment in the middle. So all of these are examples of how the number 3 works in terms of aspects of how our body works, aspects of physiology. Eventually, we will also be looking at the number 3 through the idea from the Huangdi Neijing about the root, branch, and middle, the Biao Zhong theory, which is also integrating the number 3. And we will also look at the open-close pivot, which also integrates the number 3. In addition, we have the 3 yin and the 3 yang of the 6 conformations, because 3 doubled is 6. We can't look at those quite yet, because we have to really go through the number 5 and 6 before we can understand Biao Zhong or Kai He Shu, the branch, root, middle, and open close pivot. So we will get to those eventually. So all of these are about yin yang interacting in order to create a third aspect. 3 is the number of all that is held between 2 poles. 1 is for unity, and then you have a separation which gives 2. This is yin yang and heaven and earth. But between the 2 in our living world, you have the perpetual exchange of influx. And for this reason, you add another stroke to 2, and you have 3. That's a quote from Elizabeth Rocher de la Valle. 3 is the number of mankind, because mankind, being between heaven and earth, best represents the influx of heaven and earth in perpetual change and co-penetration. For this reason, 3 is also the special number of Qi, which we'll get to when we get to the 3 treasures, because everything is exchanged between the 2 poles of the median space is Qi. So number 3 is really the beginning of this circular movement in time-space. So Ling Shu chapter 81 says, yin-yang now spread out, and because of breath, this movement is along the invisible Jing. So Here we have yin yang now spread out because of breath. And here, breath is how Elizabeth Roche de la Valle translates the word chi. So yin yang now spread out because of breath. This movement along the invisible jing, which are these vertical guide ropes and connecting threads that we talked about last time, the gang ji, the guide ropes and connecting threads, are these jing, these channels, and that's the word for the meridians in our body, the channels in our body. So this movement is along the visible vertical guide ropes and connecting threads, increasingly following the circular patterns of the Tao, combined with the contract from heaven. So a word about this idea of the Qi Jiao, the Qi interaction. And Huangdi asks in chapter 68, he says, what is it to say Qi Jiao, this Qi interaction? And Qi Bo answers, man resides in the middle of above and below, and the Qi Jiao between the interaction, and in the Qi Jiao of between the interaction of above and below. Thus, it is said, the upper aspect of the heavenly pivot is governed by the Qi of heaven. The lower aspect of the heavenly pivot is governed by the Qi of earth. The human being follows the Qi Jiao, and the myriad things originate from it. The human being is this interaction and follows this interaction, and it's this interaction that gives rise to a person and the myriad beings. The upper aspect of the heavenly pivot is governed by the Qi of heaven, and here we'll just look at this image to see the upper aspect. Here it's a pulse image, and on the left we have the heart, on the right the lung pulse. Those are the Tsun positions. So we have this Qi of heaven above, the human being follows the Qi Jiao of the myriad things in the Qi Jiao, and the lower aspect is governed by the Qi of the earth. So we have sort of this image of the San Jiao also. So within our bodies, heaven, earth, and middle are reflected. Our bodies themselves are the middle between heaven and earth, but within our bodies, we also have that idea of three mirrored. And the meaning of this word Jiao, the San Jiao, is that all elements of the body are well linked together and converge on the same stem. At the same time, there is a kind of fire which provides the necessary warmth to be alive. And again, those are the words of Elizabeth Roche de la Valle. For me, I translate the Jiao as the three areas of the body where there is transformation of food and fluids through the action of fire. And usually I keep it untranslated, not translating it as heater or warmer, and just keeping it at San Jiao, because I think it's a broad concept that can't be pinpointed as a heater or a warmer. In Su Wen 4, it says the San Jiao is a fu, which means that it is hollow and therefore needs to be opened through. The San Jiao has all these aspects of reception, transformation, diffusion, and elimination. The San Jiao are the pathways for the entry and exit of liquids and cereals. This refers not only to the act of swallowing and excreting, but to everything that allows me to receive and introduce something into my body other than myself, something that comes from the outside. The San Jiao gives unity to all of these operations between entry and exit. In Su Wen 8, the San Jiao is responsible for the opening up of passages and irrigation. The waterways stem from it. If the human being is just combining heaven's power with earth's ability to receive, It is the fire of heaven and the water of earth which make the human. The Sanjiao affects the mixing of water and fire in the kidneys. Fire and water at the level of the kidneys are like the primitive and fundamental unity of the living being. So just to summarize that, when we're thinking about the number 3, and we have the Sanjiao, the upper, the lower, and the middle, that all together, this is an umbrella concept that looks at all the ways we're receiving, transforming, and exiting. We're looking at all the ways that this happens, and that she says it gives unity to all of these operations. And another way of saying that is that it's an umbrella concept for all of these operations of taking something in from outside, transforming it into me, and expressing it back out again. And that another way to kind of summarize that is this mixing of fire and water, this active mixing of fire and water. So the Sanjiao is an organ of the fire phase. It's an umbrella concept to organize the human being's creation, physiology, and the expression in the number 3. Then there's a relationship to the fu of the Sanjiao, but the fu is not the same as Shaoyang conformation, and that's something we'll get to. Differentiating the Zhang fu and versus the Shaoyang conformation. So there's a relationship to the conformation, but it's not the same thing as the conformation, the Shaoyang conformation. So the Sanjiao doesn't leave yin yang behind. In fact, it's through the Sanjiao that yin yang moves and generates life. So here we have an image of the Sanjiao, and through the Sanjiao, it's an umbrella concept of fire coming in to become the ministerial fire, and then interacting with water and going up and out in the body. And here we have this interaction of yin and yang pictured in the lower jiao as the kidney yin and yang. Notice the yang is underneath. So the kidney yin and yang are interacting like a fire under a cooking pot. And as they interact, the movement going back up out in the east, that fire that's inside the fluid is what we call blood. And the fire is what makes it move upward. It's what makes it warm. It's what makes it turn red. So and again, we have the blood being a yin yang symbol that's created from the primary yin yang of the kidneys, and that becomes the liver blood. And then as that interacts further, it continues to steam upward. It's natural for the fire and water mixing, just like steam, for it to float upward. And on the surface of the body, we have the yang aspect wei inside the yin aspect of the blood. So that is what happens in the east. In the lower jiao, yin yang, middle jiao, the fluid with the ministerial fire, and as that process moves upward in the body, it becomes the harmonized yin and wei. Yin and wei, harmonized means that the wei is inside of the yin, and that's related to the upper jiao. And so we have that steaming up process, yang coming in, steaming up fluids. So we have it in the west where it says the Sanjiao is the sluice gates of grains and fluids, as well as the yang heat traveling downward through the 3 jiao on the right. So we have traveling through from the upper to the middle to the lower, and then that fire pivoting and going up like this as integrated yin yang into blood, into yin wei in the upper jiao. So we want to notice that there is downward movement in the Sanjiao, and there's upward movement in the Sanjiao because it's unifying the whole process. So we have fire and water coming in, and we have them interacting and getting into right relationship, and then going from more concentrated yin yang to blood to harmonized yin wei as it gets more diffused towards the surface. So the Sanjiao is an internal mirror of heaven, person, and earth. The energy of heaven moves down, the energy of earth moves upward, so that the communication of energies takes place in the middle where man resides. The energy of the person is guided by the region in which the communications of energies take place and form, from which the origin is established. The region above the waist is heaven, and below the waist is earth. This is from the Sulam. So here's another image. And here we're taking in food and fluids. And I think it's good to be aware that these plants that are pictured here, they all receive light from heaven. You know, so they grow because of the light from heaven. And so it's through eating these plants that have received that light that we also receive the light. So it's not just magical, we receive light from heaven, and we do directly receive light from heaven, but we also receive it through these plants, and even from eating animals that have eaten these plants, that are the way that we take in the light from heaven. So we eat these foods and fluids, and they go down into our body from our mouth through the three warmers. And those food and fluids become the base yin yang. So we're receiving yang, we're receiving yin, it becomes the base yin yang, which interacts, because if fire is below water, it's going to interact to create life. And that's going to be a steaming up process. In the previous slides, we looked at that steaming up process as going from more condensed yin yang into less condensed blood, and then into the steam of the harmonized yin and wei. So you can see that we are never leaving yin yang. We're still receiving yang in on the right. In the west, it's going down, 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 and then it's transforming into me and being expressed back upward on the left. So one thing I want to point out is that, you know, the Sanjiao theory isn't a separate theory from yin yang. It's, you know, a way to think about it is that it's adding another layer of complexity to, so that we're able to look at the complexity of a human being without ever leaving yin yang theory. You know, so we go into the number 3, now we can see more details when we go into the number 3, but we're still staying with the basic reception of yang from heaven, interacting and being expressed back out. We never leave that. So the Sanjiao and the pulse positions. So the Sanjiao, or the number 3, we could say, is expressed in 2 different ways with the pulse. One is that the pulse positions are a mirror of the 3 jiao. So the Cun position represents the heart and the lungs, and the Guan position, the middle of the body, the liver and spleen, and the Chi position, the kidney yang and the kidney yin. And there are different ways that people think about the pulses that we won't get into here, but basically the Chi position is the lower jiao. So that we're thinking of that with that image that's on the right of your screen. The Cun Guan Chi is reflecting the 3 jiao. We can also turn the hand, and we can see that the superficial pulse also represents the upper body, the middle pulse, the middle of the pulse, the middle of the body, and the deep pulse, the lower body. This could also be turned so that it's the outside of the body, more interior, and even more interior with both of these. But we're looking at the body then through the number 3 and feeling the pulse very much reflects this division. So the pulse reflects the downward reception of yang and fluids on the right. So we're looking at another image of the pulse. So if we take the yin-yang symbol and impose it on this, the right pulse is yang coming down, and the left pulse is yang coming up from within the yin. So when you're taking the pulse, you can reflect on this. How are things coming down? You know, so any blockage on the way down is really going to be reflected on the right side of the pulse. And then those fluids and yang interact, and it gets steamed up on the left. And so deficiency of yin and blood, and is that yin and blood reaching all the way up in an integrated way? That's going to be expressed on the left side of the pulse. So this is again through the 3 gel. I do want to point out that this is one energetic that is extremely useful to superimpose on the pulse, and you will really be able to see a lot of what's going on with the conformations and consider what kinds of herbs you're going to use to correct that through superimposing this yin-yang image onto what you're feeling in the pulse. However, there's also another image here that's also extremely useful. And so I just want to point out that in this image of the pulses, if you start in the lower right, where you have the Heart Master and the Shinju and the Sanjiao, it's also sometimes called the Kidney Yang, that there are arrows going up. And those arrows represent the Sheng cycle of the Wu Xing. So we have fire generating earth, going up, earth generating metal. And then a kind of figure 8 where metal is generating water, then going up, water is generating wood, wood is generating fire, and then fire travels down, the imperial fire travels down to become the ministerial fire, and that cycle continues. So there's another cycle that's a figure 8 kind of cycle. So another image you can superimpose onto the pulse as you're feeling it is really just asking, how is it going in terms of the Sheng cycle? You know, where is there excess? Where is there deficiency in the relationship between the Wu Xing? So both of those images are very useful clinically. But for now, we're looking at the number 3, and we're just looking at the way that yang is received from above all the way to below, and then there's an interaction of yin yang to become the middle. So let me just go into that a little bit more, which is we have up in the upper warmer the lungs and the heart, and really we could say those are receiving yang influences. The lung takes it down to become the kidney water, the heart takes it down to become the ministerial fire. Then we have that kidney yang and kidney yin interacting to become wood and earth in the middle, or we could say flesh and blood, the person. So we have another way to look at this is to see there's the pre-heaven up above. We're receiving that which has not come into form. In a way we could say that's the future, everything that has not yet come into form, and it's being taken into the body, into the foundational yin yang, which we could say is the present moment. It interacts to become flesh and blood. And the flesh and blood is the post-heaven person that also represents the past, what's been created in the past. And that then this human being, this flesh and blood, this being of the myriad beings, is then an instrument to receive more influences from heaven. So the process is really continuous. So you can look at it as a figure eight going in a figure eight pattern. You can also look at it as receiving influences down into the root that transform to create a being that then can receive more influences to be taken down. So the left and the right work together in that yin-yang process. Okay, so now that we've sort of explored some of the foundation of the number three and seen how it relates to pulse positions as well as to the Sanjiao in the body, let's take a look at this number three, which is the three treasures, the Shen, the Jing, and the Qi. So usually we think of the three treasures as just three things. You know, we have three treasures like apples, pears, and oranges. But if we remember that any accumulation of three things in East Asian medicine is always going to be the first thing creating the second thing, interacting with it to create the third thing. So we have the Shen manifesting as Jing, and therefore there is Qi. So let's talk about what is Shen. And of course, there are many definitions of it and many ways to think about it. So I'm just offering some that has to do with the way that I think about it. It doesn't mean that other ways to think about it are not equally as valid. And I'm taking some commentary from Kiko Matsumoto. She writes in her Hara Diagnosis Reflections on the Sea, no form is the precursor of material things. From the point at which it cannot be perceived to a perceived state is light, and then evolves into a materialized state, which is water. And then Shen, as the eternal unchanging principle, constantly transforms no form into form, and no form and form into no form at death. And then here from the Huainanzi, formless Shen desiring incarnation, earth rises becoming mist, heaven descends becoming rain. The form is the abode of life, the Qi is the fullness of life, Shen is the controller of life. So we see there are three things, the form, the Shen, and the Qi. No form is the great ancestor of matter. No sound is the great ancestor of the voice. The child of no form is light. The grandchild of no form is water. All is created from no form. So you have this sort of this no form, this emptiness, maybe we could even call it the oneness that gives rise to light, that then creates water, which is the beginning of form, that finds its fullness as Qi. Here's a beautiful quote. I just love this. It's from a book that really has nothing to do with East Asian medicine. This is a book by Gretel Ehrlich from her book, A Match to the Heart. And this is a memoir about her experience of being hit by lightning. And she writes, the word inspiration reminds me that even in our secular culture, our language still lets us know the way that flesh and spirit are fused. An intake of breath is not just oxygen, A pulse is not just the rush of blood, but also the taking in of divinity through an orifice, and as it moves through, it becomes a spark. To be inspired is to have accepted spirit in the lungs and heart, to watch it circulate through miles of blood vessels, capillaries, whose tiny fenestrations allow oxygen, nutrients, and grace to leak into the tissues of muscles and consciousness, then to be taken up again, reoxygenated, and returned. You would think she was writing about physiology in East Asian medicine. Elizabeth Rocher Del Valle and Claude Lar say the heart is essentially a void because void is the only dwelling place for the spirits. And we want to notice they translate Shen as the spirits, plural. The heart is a void as the possibility of receiving influences in the form of Shen. The spirits can only rest and dwell in the void of the heart. The art of the heart, which is a famous discipline in Chinese philosophy, is the way to obtain and conserve this void, which allows the spirits to be present. The heart, as a void, has the possibility of receiving spiritual influences in the form of Shen. From all of this emanates the radiance of the spirits, the Shen Ming. This enables life to be led, but in a subtle way, which is invisible and imperceptible. So Shen, as the eternal unchanging principle, constantly transforms no form into form and form into no form at death. So we also see that this corresponds to the upper jiao being the receiving place of yang that's coming in from heaven to be received all the way into me, so that the pre-heaven, no form, can be transformed into the post-heaven form to be given back out and become no form again. You know, that this corresponds with that cycle, and Shen being relatively young, being related to light. So it's relatively young, you know, is part of what comes down from heaven into me. It's part of that yang that's coming down in from heaven into each being, which enables life to be led in this invisible, imperceptible way, these spiritual influences. So now let's look at the physiology of Jing. So we're sort of seeing what Shen is, this, just going back to Shen for a moment, we see Shen as this, you know, this light that comes in that also has an intelligence and a warmth to it. So this is these spiritual influences coming into me that are received by me. And now we say that the Shen, it creates the Jing in a way. You know, we know that the images are handed down from heaven, you know, these images and this intelligence, and it's from those images that the Jing is created. So if we look at the character of Jing, we have the rice radical on the left, and on the right, we have this character Qing, which is about something green and new growing up. So this is the character for Jing, which we often translate as essence. Now, what we learn about Jing normally, or what I learned in my regular TCM education that most of us had, is that Jing is a kind of substance, almost like an elixir, that is, you know, almost visualized as being in a vial somewhere between the two kidneys, and that we can use it up. We can use up this precious liquid if we're not careful to preserve it. And if we have, you know, too much sex, drugs, and rock and roll, we use up our Jing quickly, and we want to preserve that Jing. So it's really talked about in terms of quantity. And so I'm going to offer a different definition of Jing, which is also talked about. But I'm going to really emphasize this other definition of Jing, which is going to be, based on some of these ways that the character is used. So we have this idea of Jingshen, which is really the spirit essence, and it relates to the luminosity of the life force within a person that comes from the Jing and the Shen interconnecting with each other. We also have this idea of Jingzi, which is a sperm, so the sense of it being an essence or a seed. Then there's the minute essences, the Jingwei, which relates to the taking in the Jing of food, having it connect to my own Jing so that it can become me. So kind of based on these ways that the character Jing is used, and here is a quote from Elizabeth Roche de la Vallée about Jingwei. If it is an element of my life that I'm able to take from another source, then it must be very subtle state in order to pass from one pattern of life, like to become from an apple, into another, to become me. The meaning of Wei is subtle or very fine. The meaning of Jingwei is therefore the intermediate state between the essences, which are then attracted into my body by my five zong in order to impregnate them. This relates to the taking of the Jing of food and having it connect to my own Jing so it can become me. Food loses its form and it becomes a new form based on essence. Essences need patterns. These patterns with rules and norms of life are given at the moment of conception of being. I am a child of my parents, and through them I'm a child of water and fire, heaven and earth. All development is due to the organization coming from the Jing essences. So we have a sense of these essences being, this Jing being pattern, a pattern or a template. Essences are the first manifestation of the formless dream and images from Shen. So the first kind of physical manifestation from formless, which is related to the Shaoyin heart, to form, which is the first form is the Jing, and that is related to the other side of the Shaoyin, which is the kidney. So the heart having the dream, the image, and creating form from it. The first bit of form is the essences, and it's a minute template that will create the being according to Shen's plan, the Shen's knowing how. Elizabeth Roche de la Vallée writes, the Jing are the guarantor and keeper of the pattern of life. In the same way that there must be a pattern for knitting, these are the essences for the reproduction of life, the rebuild the shape that I have. So when a woman becomes pregnant, there's the Jing that's created from the Jing of the woman, and the Jing of the man creates a new template that then knows how to create the new baby according to the plan. There's a template there. There's a plan of how to organize this. And then, the baby is born, starts eating food from outside, and it connects with that child's Jing. And you don't become an apple when you eat apples, or, become a goat if you eat goat. It transforms because it connects with your own Jing that tells the essences how to create you, how to create that being, how to create me out of that food. It has to connect with something in order to know what to create it into. And that template is the Jing. So it's really not a liquid essence that can be used up. That we'll talk about what then would Jing deficiency be. We have that idea in Chinese medicine. So if it's just a template, how can it be deficient? So Jing essences, going back to the Suen, it says heaven or Shen hangs the images, which is the Jing, the channels, and then earth completes the form. So Jing essences are not simply a substance that we can treasure or waste. Jing essences are the dream of the spirits and are the template or images. So here I made a mistake calling the Jing above as the channels, but it's actually through the channels that information comes through. So and that the knowing how comes through, and that's through the channels that it can connect with the Jing so that earth can complete the form. Jing essences are between form and no form. So they're not quite the form of the person, but when no form connects with that template, it's between form and no form. So there's something there, but it's relatively formless, but it has the information on how to create that person. Jing essences are yin relative to the Shen's yang. Jing essences are a template and a pattern for the creation of form. Jing essences are homing to Shaoyin, and they are everywhere in the body. So we receive that light through the heart. It creates and connects to the Jing in the kidneys, but we know that there are water points on the channels, and those are an expression of the kidneys. That the fact that it's related to the kidneys doesn't mean that the Jing isn't everywhere in the body. So I hope that this gives an idea of Jing as this template. And just to say then, what then would be Jing deficiency? And for me, the Jing deficiency has to do with if the Shen is not able to connect with the template because our bodies are out of alignment with that flow from heaven. And that can happen. And often it happens because the kidney energy is so weak that it doesn't the kidneys need to be firm and upright. And it's almost like the kidneys are creating a kind of altar upon which the Jing sits. And when that altar is nice and firm, the light comes in, connects with the template, and knows how to recreate me. Now imagine if the kidneys are weak and that altar is off kilter or even sinking down, then the light comes in and it can't connect in a full way with that instruction, with that Jing. So another question that students have asked me over time is, what about somebody who has a disorder of the Jing? We can tell there's a relationship between Jing and DNA, and I'm very hesitant and would not say that they are the same thing, but certainly there's a strong relationship. So say somebody has Down syndrome, something like that, and that's not a Jing deficiency at all. The Jing is fine. It's really that the template that was created is saying create the person in this way, and so there are, quote, genetic problems, say like cystic fibrosis is a genetic problem, but the Jing is not the problem. The Jing is just saying create the body in this way, and it's creating a body that doesn't know how to transform mucus in the lungs and doesn't have the right enzymes for digesting properly, which is the nature of cystic fibrosis. But the Shen is connecting just right to the Jing. It's just that the Jing is saying, create the person like this. And in those kinds of cases, if we're treating somebody with, say, cystic fibrosis or Down syndrome, what we can do, we don't want to treat that as a gene deficiency just because it's a genetic problem. What we do instead is we help the body cope with the results of the body creating itself as the Jing is expecting it to. So if the Jing is saying, create a body that doesn't know how to do transform mucus in the lungs, then the body is not going to know how to do that because it's not in the basic instructions. So we can help the body cope with the fact that it doesn't know how to do that itself, and we can do a lot for those kinds of problems, then help the body transform phlegm, help the body digest the food. But we can't change the Jing, and we would never want to treat that as a Jing deficiency, because it's not a matter of it being deficient or that even the connection to the Jing is upset. It's just this is what the Jing said to create, and so that's what is created in the body. Okay, so we know that when there are three things, the one creates and connects to the second one and starts a relationship with it, a yin-yang relationship with it, and therefore there's the third thing. And in classical medicine, that third thing is called qi. So here's some images to express this. So what then is qi? And that's a big question, and there's certainly many answers to it. And so what we'll be looking at is sort of a very broad definition of qi. So we know that Shen manifests as Jing, and therefore there is qi. So one thing we can think about is, if we saw that the Shen is relatively yang, it creates something that's relatively yin. And in the Huainanzi, it's referred to as water. So imagine there's this watery form that is this template, and there's light shining down on it. And so when heat hits a wet surface, what happens is that there's a steaming up. So that steaming up is the qi. And this is also the same, exactly the same as the yang coming down from heaven, interacting with the yin, and therefore creating the form. Heaven and earth interacting to create the form. So really, the qi is the form of the body. In the broadest sense, the qi is the form of the body. Now, I think a beautiful image that I have here is that if light is shining down onto a wet earth and causing a steaming up of form of moisture, and then that light is still shining through that cloud that's being created, what do we get? We get a rainbow. In other words, we can see that evolution into the number 5, into the 5 colors. And I think that's sort of symbolic of the creation of a human being that has these 5 phases, these 5 colors and 5 sounds. Okay, so a few quotes about the physiology of the Shen becoming qi. Wang Chong in 27 to 97 AD, he wrote that qi produces the human body just as water becomes ice. As water freezes into ice, so qi coagulates to form a human body. When ice melts, it becomes water. When a person dies, he or she becomes spirit again. It's called Shen, just as melted ice changes its name into water. And then Zhang Cai, in somewhere around the early 1000s, wrote, the great void consists of qi. Qi condenses to become the myriad things. Things of necessity disintegrate and return to the great void. If qi condenses, its visibility becomes effective and physical form appears. And then in the 1600s, Wang Fuji wrote, life is not creation from nothing, and death is not the complete dispersion and destruction. Despite the condensation and dispersion of qi, its original substance can neither be added nor be lessened. All that is void and empty is full of qi, which in its state of condensation and thus visible is called being. But in its state of dispersion and thus no longer visible, it's called non-being. When dispersing qi makes the great void only regaining its original misty feature, but not perishing. When condensing, it becomes the origin of all beings. So we have this idea that qi condensed becomes form, becomes visible form, and qi dispersed becomes invisible. So we have these relative density of qi. So we're still talking about the shen forming the jing and then interconnecting to create the qi. And qi, when it's condensed, is a being, and when it's dispersed, it's non-being. What we learn about qi is really the primary way I learned about qi when I was in my basic TCM education is that qi was thought of as yang relative to blood. That's how I learned about it, was as yang, this yang that's inside the blood, that blood is made up of qi and fluid, the qi is the warm part, the blood is like the liquid part, and that the qi warms and moves, uplifts and holds, it transforms and it protects. So I'm guessing most people learned about qi this way as well. And this isn't at all wrong. It's just looking at qi through a certain lens, and that's not the lens we're looking at it through when we're talking about the jing, the shen, jing, and the qi. We're talking about it in a much broader sense than that. So qi is in a constant state of flux and in various states of aggregation. When it condenses, energy transforms and accumulates into physical form. Many types, rarefied and dense, but all are one qi. It's important to see the universality and the particularity of qi simultaneously. So this is from Elizabeth Rocher Del Valle. And so we can see that everything is qi, and it's in various forms of condensation and rarefication. Everything is qi. That's how we're talking about it here. So we can also consider qi pathology, and the qi pathology has to do with how condensed or dispersed it is in a particular location. And in a particular location, it's supposed to be a certain amount of condensed or dispersed. And if it's too condensed, we call that excess. And if it's too dispersed, we call that deficiency. So excessive condensation is stagnation. So dispersing that makes something less dense. And excessive dispersion is called deficiency. So tonification is making something more dense and consolidated. So qi deficiency then becomes something that's vapid, uncondensed, and in an unconsolidated form. So when we think of qi deficiency, we often think of the spleen's function of wrapping the blood. Here we'll expand the knowledge of what organs are involved with helping hold the blood and other fluids in place, as well as what it means to wrap. Actually, we're not going to do that here, but we're looking at this idea of wrapping, which means to hold something together in a unified system. So we can see that this spleen qi deficiency, the reason it doesn't wrap the blood is because it's vapid, uncondensed, unconsolidated. My teacher, Dr. Zhou, who I studied with in Hangzhou, writes this character points, this tongue to wrap character points to the spleen's function of holding the blood and fluids together in a unified system through absorption. Later, she speaks of the kidney's role in preventing bleeding, using the following term to gu shi, which is to consolidate through absorption. So we have this sense of qi deficiency. I guess the image that I want to give for qi deficiency is too vapid, like a sponge that should absorb, but it has to be a nice tight sponge with small holes in order to absorb and hold. You know, if you have a sponge where the holes are really big and you try to wipe up a puddle, it's just going to drip out. But a nice dense sponge is going to absorb, and then you hold it up, it's not going to drip out. And then if it's too dense, it's not even going to absorb at all. You know, that it has to be the right amount of density. So you can think of qi deficiency not as like a quantity, not enough qi, but as this qi that's not dense enough. So this is basically what I'm saying here. One way that qi can be thought of is as the quality of tightness and density of the sponge-like quality of the lungs, the spleen, and the kidneys, which are the three organs that can have qi deficiency. When the qi is strong, the tightness and density of the sponge is good, and so it can absorb and hold fluids. When the qi is weak, this can be thought of as the sponge being loose with larger holes. When the qi of these organs is weak, blood and fluids are not absorbed and they're into their physiological position, so they leak out. And the clinical relevance of this understanding of absorption when the qi is weak and therefore there's leaking, the treatment principle would be to strengthen the absorptive capacity of the organ involved. This is different than how we usually think of tonifying the qi. We usually think of tonifying the qi as simply increasing its strength or quantity. This is not, it's not that it's incorrect, but it's not the whole picture. But it does not give us a language to see the relationship between the qi and the fluids clearly. When we strengthen the qi to stop leakage, we're not simply closing a gate, tightly staunching the flow. We're actually increasing the absorptive capacity of the body so the fluids naturally stay in place. One reason why this concept is so important clinically is that we can now see how qi deficiency, this lack of the absorptive capacity, can lead to dryness or fluid damage and to dampness. You know, so if the qi is not absorbing well, then the fluids can leak out and we lose fluids and our yin gets damaged, like with diarrhea or too much sweating or too much bleeding. And also, if it's not absorbed and the fluids stick around in our body instead of leaking out, but they're not in right relationship, it leads to damp accumulation. So kind of with spleen or kidney deficiency, the difference between the qi deficiency leading to fluid damage or leading to dampness is just, are those fluids leaking out or are they accumulating in the body? Qi deficiency leading to dryness or fluid damage. The mechanism here is that the fluids leak out and there's a loss of physiological fluid, which leads to dryness or fluid damage. Qi deficiency leading to dampness. The mechanism here is that when the fluids are not absorbed into physiological relationship in the body, they can accumulate in the body as pathological fluids. Also, dampness and dryness due to qi deficiency can coexist. You know, so if fluids are accumulating in the body, they're pathological. And as we learned in the previous lesson, pathological fluids cannot perform a physiological function. So it's not at all uncommon for there to be dampness, which is pathological accumulation. But since physiologically the fluids are not being absorbed, there's also dryness. So this number 3 never abandons the yin yang. So the Shen creates the Jing, it interacts to create the Qi. And this also relates to the pre-heaven, creating the post-heaven body. And it also relates to the future, what's possible, the pre-heaven. Coming into the present moment and with where the Jing is, and becoming form, which is the evidence that something happened in the past. So the seat of the present moment is in the Shaoyin's health. Okay, so I mentioned briefly that we will be talking about the number 3 relative to Biao Ben Dong, which is the manifestation, root, and middle, and Kai Ho Shu, which is the open close pivot. We need a little bit more advanced training in the physiology in order to understand these concepts, what they mean. But it will always go back to the basic principles of the number 3. So a summary of right relationship of yin yang depending on the qi jiao, which is that qi interconnector in between yin yang, in between heaven and earth, which is also the person. All pathology is yin-yang coming out of right relationship in one way or another. Yin-yang come into right relationship and create the person, or the middle, or the qi-jiao. The person, the middle, the qi-jiao is what keeps yin-yang in right relationship. All the healing, making whole is helping yin-yang come back into right relationship so it can create the person in the proper way. And just a reminder that pathological substances, they're pathological substances and physiological substances. We have something called the 6 qi, which are, there are 3 yang, wind, sultry, heat, fire, and 3 yin qi, dry, damp, and cold. And all of these are both pathological or physiological, depending on our relationship to them. So they help our body. All of these qi, we usually learn about them as only pathological, but this is actually the qi that our bodies are made up of. And these are in various states of condensation and dispersion, and various states of cold and heat, and various states of damp and dry. And so these are actually the qi that make up the human body. And we want to stay in right relationship with these 6 qi to have a healthy body. And when we aren't in right relationship with them, these qi actually become pathological qi. Physiological substances are the 6 qi in right relationship with the yin-yang dynamic. They're held in right relationship without leaking out, and they're moving well within the yin-yang. So we looked last time about these pathological substances versus physiological, and how we don't see we don't see yin or yang unless it is pathological. And there are these 2 sources of pathological substances. One are just my bodily substances, my warmth, my cold, my dry, my damp, that are coming out of right relationship. And just this image just shows us the simple, when fire comes out of right relationship, it tends to go up and be hot. When water comes out of right relationship, it tends to go out and down and be more cold. Bodily, and we also have bodily substances which stay in the body that become excess due to blockage, that our body is moving too slowly. So there's blockage, and then these substances can become pathological. And just as I said, that they become apparent, they become visible when they're pathological, and that when our bodies are healthy, we don't see yin or yang. We only see the integration of yin and yang as kind of luminous, active, alive form. Yin yang are sort of perfectly interconnected with each other. And Zheng Qinan says, solitary yin will not generate life, solitary yang will not extend. So that's to say, if it's solitary, meaning out of right relationship, just yin, it can't generate life. And solitary yang, just yang, won't create anything. It can't create anything. So without yang, yin will not be generated. Without yin, yang cannot transform. And just as this is kind of a far ahead note, but it's also why a lot of Zhang Zhongjing's formulas use yang in order to generate yin. So rather than giving Liu Wei Di Huang Wan, Zhang Zhongjing, in order to generate yin, gives Jin Gui Shen Qi Wan. In order to generate stomach yin, Zhang Zhongjing gives something like Xiao Jian Zhong Tang, because you need yang in order to nebulize and transform the yin. So a formula that's just solitary yin is not going to work very well, because without yang, it won't transform into physiological. Once there's heaven, earth, and person, along with the circulation of heaven, the four directions are defined. So this is how we move from number 3 to number 4, because once we have heaven above and earth below, and there's a person, and there's naturally circulation, then we have morning, noon, dusk, night, and that happens in the four directions. Morning is defined by the sun coming up in the east and zenithing in the south, setting in the west, and then being further in the north through the night. So the four directions are automatically defined. They sort of unfold because of the number 3. We get to the number 4. So now we're going to talk briefly about the number 4. And in our next class, we're going to move to number 5, and which are the wuxing, and into number 6, which are the 6 confirmations, the 6 channels, the 6 great sweeping motions. So these are the 4 quadrants, and this is an ancient coin. And we can see the 4 quadrants defined on this coin. You can see here on the left, this dragon is going upward because that's the nature of the east. And the red phoenix is in the south. And then the white tiger is in the west going down. That's what happens in the west if you face south. And then we have the black turtle, that is something that submerges under the water. And so in the north, we have the black turtle. So this is the 4 directions defined into these 4 quadrants. And each of these quadrants actually holds 7 constellations that relate to the lunar mansions. And so here we also have an ancient Han Dynasty coin, and we see that the typical structure for a Chinese coin is with a square in the middle. So the coin itself is sort of describing Earth, and then the circulation of heaven around Earth. Just shows how embedded this way of looking at things is in the Chinese culture. So here we have Earth as the center, and this is where the person is. I have a person there who's facing south, and we can see that the person is the Qi Jiao, between heaven and earth, is created from heaven and earth, but also is the organism that helps heaven and earth connect with each other, that's created for this purpose. And also that the soil, and here we're differentiating between the D below, which is the earth, and the two, which is the yellow ball, that's the soil. I translate the two as soil. It's often also translated as earth, but to make sure we're differentiating between these two ideas, I like to translate it as soil. So we have heaven and earth, which is Tian, heaven, Di, earth, and they interact to create the Qi Jiao. And the Qi Jiao is the person, but it is also the soil. So this earth is different than the pre-heaven, heaven and earth. It's the post-heaven earth, which is also a connector between heaven and earth. And the earth, that's the soil in a person, is our middle jiao, which is the qi jiao in our bodies, which connects the upper and lower body. I hope this physiology is clear. So this soil tu is form, whereas this di is actually like an essence. It's like jing, because it's like heaven and earth that has the template for creating the myriad beings, the forms of the myriad beings. So heaven sends down the images to earth, and then it creates the myriad beings, which includes to the soil and all the trees and all the animals and the rocks. Everything is created according to that image. So these two characters, tu versus di, are really quite different. So soil, tu, and the person are both created from the pre-heaven interaction between Tian and Di. So Tian and Di interact to create the soil and the person, and then the soil and the person are also the fulcrum that help. So heaven and earth can interact because there's me. You know, I'm a vehicle for the interaction between heaven and earth. So we also have this idea of earth as the center of the four directions. And of course, you can see we go directly from 4 to 5, because these are the wuxing, right? But here we have the wuxing with the earth as the center. And also it's these 18 days in between each of the 4 seasons is defined as the earth. It sort of interconnects all of the other of the wuxing, and we could say even that the earth is the terrain upon which the wuxing live. Here's an image of the stems and branches, and you can see the ones that relate to earth are in these 4 corners. They're neither east, west, north, or south, but the yellow character is related to earth, is in these 4 corners. So we have this image of earth as the center. And here's an image of the person, and we know that like the spleen rules the 4 limbs. And so I just thought it would be good to superimpose this image of the human being and the middle jiao right there in the middle. And this being the terrain upon which these other movements happen. So we have soil and we have the person. So when 3, heaven, earth, and person/soil give us a person standing on soil, we have the 4 directions plus the soil, which is the wuxing. And this is the physiology expanding into the number 5, which is 4 with a center. Okay, so thank you very much for listening to this part. And I know it's kind of slow and laborious as we go through this, but I really want to, set a foundation and go through the numbers and always keep coming back through the numbers as to how they are still related to yang and yin coming into right relationship and receiving yang from heaven and forming it into me and me expressing it back out to be able to receive more influences. So thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you soon in the next session of this course.